So this is me continuing to make a vain attempt to catch up on a backlog of commissioned reviews. A reminder, you can commission me through the Patreon, and since I am now working through that backlog, hopefully the weight will trim down. Eventually, I'm working on it. So I got commissioned to take a look at the first 3 episodes of a series that aired last year in the UK called Noughts and Crosses. So this was a show that I knew nothing about. I hadn't even really heard of it, and it's not that surprising given that in the US it shows through the streaming service Peacock. I'm not going to say nobody has Peacock, but who knows what's on there off the top of their head? Yeah, that's what I thought. So this is going to be kind of a difficult thing for me to figure out the best way to try and talk about. Because it's dealing with a lot of loaded subjects, and I'm not certain that I know how well it's dealing with them. And I don't mean that I would have had to see the whole show. I mean there are things that are making me go, but I don't know if my read or my takeaways are accurate. So basically, ultimately, this is a show about race. That is what it's about. I'll get into the specifics in a minute if you haven't heard of it. So, and obviously, when it comes to issues of racial inequality, particularly the racial inequality of blacks, which is ultimately what this is largely dealing with, although in a weird metaphorical sort of twisted, again, I'll get to that. So I don't really have a place to say how good or bad I think it's doing. But at the same time, I was commissioned to review this thing, so I am going to still have to turn a critical eye to it, and I can't not talk about that. That's literally the whole point of the show. So, we'll try. We'll see how we do. So, I got very nervous about this show. I'd say about 10 seconds in, as it laid out its premise. The premise is, this is an alternate history Earth. Now, most of the time when you deal with alternate histories, they tend to not go back more than 1, maybe 200 years. There's an awful lot of alternate histories around the Cold War, World War II. In the US, there's a fair number of them around the Civil War and the Confederacy and things like that. But alternate histories that stretch further back than that, it's not that they don't exist, but they're certainly less common. So this one postulates that around 700 years ago, colonization became a big thing, but it wasn't European countries colonizing the rest of the world. It was Africa colonizing Europe. And so when we open, we are dealing with a Britain that is basically, it's not meant to be a direct analogy to this, but it's a bit like when America was a British colony. It is far enough away from the rest of the empire that it's kind of got its own issues and its own way of going about how to try and deal with them. But it is absolutely, unquestionably, and hammered in repeatedly, this is a society in which the African and the black population are the dominant political power. And I'm not just saying they're currently in power out of the... No. This segregation is the law. So that's one of the first things that this did that sort of made me realize they're going about it in a smart way. Because the stupidest way, the worst and stupidest way to address this concept would have been to literally just take the world we currently live in and swap the roles of black and white people. That would have been absolutely the worst way to do it, because it would fail to recognize the ways in which the world would look different if a different civilization had been in power and had built this system. Now, there's still going to be a fair number of similarities for 2 reasons, one of which is sort of the purpose of the thing and one of which is very much practical. as far as purpose goes, you can't drift it too far away from the actual real life dichotomy that is going on in terms of tensions when one race of people is of a higher class in society than another. You can't create a world so unique that it feels like it distances from that concept, because that is the concept of what we're doing. So there's still plenty of stuff that you can directly parallel to things in history that have or are currently happening. So the other thing is there was going to be a practical logistical cost issue. So to make a comparison, I could not help but think a little bit about Black Panther and the way that Wakanda was developed. So Wakanda, which had Marvel and Disney money to spend, was designed from the ground up as a nation that had never been colonized in a purely African civilization. And what would that look like? And also taking it forward in terms of technology versus where we are right now. While I would have liked to have seen something like that, a more from the ground up, down to the architecture and the tech and like all the basic building blocks of society being at least slightly different from being dominated by a different culture, logistically that was never going to happen on a TV budget. They need to be able to shoot in locations that they can redress, but like they cannot build either practically or in CGI a whole new architecture style or technology style or things like that. While that would have certainly enhanced what it was doing, that wouldn't be practical for a TV show to do. On TV budget money. Like, you'd have to have HBO throwing Game of Thrones money at a show for it to be able to do that. So there are some limitations to how thoroughly this altering of the history sort of changes things, but there's way more consideration as to how it wouldn't just look like white supremacy with an inverted color filter. It would actually look, there would be resemblances, because any direct superior, there's going to be similarities in a racially superior outlook and society. There will absolutely be parallels, but it's not going to be a one-to-one, because it's not the same kind of people with the same kind of history in charge, so there's going to be little alterations, little differences. So there are some things that are more directly analogous, like they have this world's equivalent of the N-word, which is used to refer to the white characters in a very derogatory way, and in context, you realize it is seen as being just as bad. Now, part of why I feel not the best equipped to tackle some of this is that I don't know enough about the racial or segregation or basically that end of history of the UK. I don't know that very well. I'm have to go out of my way at this point to get a better sense of that in my own dang country, because my school education on the subject was not zero, but it was woefully underdeveloped. So I've been trying to make up for that, but my focus has been within my own country. So I don't know, when there are things that I see, I don't know if they are addressing a specific thing from Britain's present or past. I would assume some things are, but I am not able to identify them. And I am hesitant to overly project the view of an American race history in my country where I live onto this show, because I suspect if it has a commentary to make, it's making it specifically about its own country. But because I can't identify whether or not it's doing that, I don't know how broad the race statements are meant to be, or if they are in fact more narrowly targeted at the specific history of the UK. They may well be, I don't know. And I'm not equipped to unpack that. But as I said, there was a lot more attention paid to how would this actually look? Because the laziest way to do it would be thanks to the Lindsay Ellis video essay from a couple years ago, I can't help but think of as anything but the Bright effect, where you just take the world we live in now and superficially change a couple of things and pretend as if that gives it meaning. Yeah, that's not how it works, and this doesn't do that, thankfully. That said, I deflated more than a little bit once I realized that they were going to be hinging a pretty sizable part of this narrative on a star-crossed lovers story. Which, look, I've got dual problems with that. The first is that I just don't appreciate romance subplots. For me, I find them distracting. And I know in this case, you can certainly make an argument that it focuses down onto a specific element of the divide between society. And like the show even plays with that, admittedly. It's not a horribly done star-crossed lovers thing. And it certainly acknowledges the reality of the world it's built while doing that. But at the same time, like, I will never particularly enjoy a story that hinges on romance between characters this young, where in the back of my head, being almost 40 and very jaded, I can't help but think, God, you are tearing your lives apart, and this is not going to last. Even if you get away from the society you're in, No, because you're young and dumb and you're banking on this like it's the one true thing that will ever happen. And I really hate when stories and narratives validate that. But again, this is far from the worst version of that. For starters, the characters are not meeting for the first time. They actually have some degree of history, and that's explained in a way that makes sense in universe. So it's not like they just met. They're not literally doing Romeo and Juliet, which Romeo and Juliet should never be done without irony and as a straight romance. Even the play itself doesn't treat it as a straight romance, but okay, that's a tangent. I do that a lot on this channel, tangenting. It's because I don't script on here. But anyways, so realizing that it could have been worse, and it never presents a love will conquer all perspective, which I appreciated, which also would have made things a bit worse. There are some things that are done that I feel a little bit muddy about, and a little bit part of me did wonder, is this show, in terms of the way it is depicting the cross, because the Noughts is the actually sort of officially sanctioned, not considered to be a slur term for white people. The crosses is the term for black people. So part of me wondered if it was a mistake to have so much of the story emphasize specific crosses who are clearly going, like, even beyond just the systematic stuff in place. Like, they really have an axe to grind against Noughts and towards propping the system up. And like, I'm not saying those kinds of people don't exist in the real world, white people actually being like that, but I at this point, I've developed a caution about any narrative about race that puts too much emphasis on the actions of individuals and ignores the implementations of systems. But within the first 3 episodes, it does make clear that both are at play in this world. So it actually did a pretty good job balancing that. One element that it did that I think was just a mistake, and I understand why they do it, but I think it was misguided. Again, perspective of a white American on a on a UK show about race relations. But the leader of what is basically a sort of a civil rights, kind of radical-edged civil rights movement for Noughts. It was actually played by the guy who plays Pete in Doctor Who, Rose's father. I don't like what they did with him. Now, from a character perspective, I understand why they did it. It gives him more nuances, shades of gray, and that's fine on the surface, but in the context of what the show is doing, it made me very uncomfortable. So there is the very first episode, we see a character who was pretty much established as the sweet boy. Too kind for this sinful earth. They might as well have had a clock over his head counting down to when he was going to get killed. Well, he gets beaten up by the cops and ends up getting hospitalized. And this character who's leading this thing, the one played by the guy who plays Pete, he goes to like visit him in the hospital and smothers him to death because a dead Nought will rally more people to his cause than a simply hospitalized one will. And again, in a vacuum, that's a totally fine choice. But in the world that we live in, knowing what sorts of things this is trying to tackle, the linking of people trying to break a demonstrably corrupt and oppressive and morally wrong system as being willing to manipulate the events in such a callous and uncaring and inhuman way because it helps them politically, that is a narrative that oppressors use when talking about resistance and progressive movements. They will talk about the sneaky, underhanded tactics. And look, there are sneaky political tactics that go on, but I'm talking about political tactics. That doing this, having him kill someone for political ends, it pushes him too close to a caricature of what, in the real world, the right says about Black Lives Matters organizers. And that made me very uncomfortable. And maybe it was supposed to. If that was the goal, I guess, job done. But I don't... Why it made me uncomfortable was this fear of somebody viewing this and drawing the very obvious connection between this character and real-world political organizers and saying, yeah, that's the kind of crap they're willing to do for their own ends. And I don't like that. That's what made me uncomfortable, was that thought. And what's more, if they wanted him morally gray, there's stuff that happens later that serves to make him morally gray, but didn't require this. So, like, he gets in kind of a weird sort of deal with the Home Secretary, who's played by Patterson Joseph, who's very good. All the acting's good, actually. I'll note that here. But I'm also going to be talking about the story and the politics of it. They get into kind of a bit of an agreement because the guy who's leading the uprising group obviously wants to depose the prime minister because she is the head of the state that is oppressing him. And Patterson Joseph's character, the Home Secretary, also wants to depose her because she's actually being nicer towards the Noughts, which is still not enough for this guy because and this is actually one of the great lines that sort of points towards an understanding of the systemic issues. He says when the Home Secretary points out, it's almost like she wants you to be nearly equal. And he says, how would you feel about a society where you were nearly equal to me? Would that be enough for you? So it does a good job of laying that out. And that's a good moment. It's a good line. But, they both, even though for absolute opposite reasons, they do both want the same end. They want her out. And so they are kind of working together, not necessarily overly conspiratorially like, mwahaha, master plan, but like there is a political advantage for them working towards the same ends. And that is something that is much less immediately morally egregious. That still muddies this character. That would have been enough. I don't think having him kill an innocent character was necessary. And actually, from my perspective, I think that was a mistake. It's worth mentioning, I think, these is actually based off a book. It might even be a book series by Marjorie Blackman, who actually was the co-writer on Rosa on Doctor Who in Series 11, which is an episode I also have very conflicted feelings about in a lot of ways. She certainly has a bold approach, and she's not unthoughtful. well, I say she. I don't know how much was changed in adaptation. It ultimately got adapted by Toby Whithouse, again, someone who I know is a writer on Doctor Who. It was originally going to have two other showrunners, one of them black, one of them white, but they had to drop out, and I couldn't find why. And Toby Whithouse, who is white, came in and took over the show running. But it did remind me of Rosa in the sense that it's tackling some very big ideas. It's not unthoughtful about how it's going about it, but there are a handful of things in here that makes me wonder, did you think fully about the implications of that? Because I get what you're trying to do, but there's a couple of hiccups here, or a couple of things that I think might actually be counter to what you're attempting. Yeah. I think that's ultimately where I land on this. I think it is interesting. It's not bad. It's not offensive, which I was afraid of, given this starting premise. But it's well acted. The characters are mostly interesting. Some of the villain characters are a little one-dimensional, but, that's not necessarily unexpected in a show like this. They're not even necessarily a bad thing, because sometimes there isn't or shouldn't be a ton of nuance to someone who's basically a race supremacist, which, again, makes it a little bit weird for me that, there isn't nuance softening and making lighter a lot of the Cross's characters who are that bad, but there is a dirtying up of the Noughts character who's fighting against, I don't know. Something about that makes me feel off. Noughts and Crosses, first 3 episodes. Did you see them? What did you think about them? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Like, share, subscribe. I already plugged the Patreon, so we can move on from that. All that stuff helps me out, but no pressure. Take a relaxed attitude around here, so just come on back next time you need a break.